States. And this is important because in a lot of cases, the F1 student visa will be valid for several years. So let's say your student visa is valid for 5 years, and you come to the United States to pursue a degree, and let's say you get your master's degree in 2 years. And then you graduate, and then you start working in H-1B status. You have, at that point, H-1B status that's noted on your I-94 departure record, and then you still will have an F1 visa in your passport that will be valid for another 3 years. But when you travel outside the United States, when you come back, you can't use that F1 visa anymore. Even though it still would have valid dates, when you come back and you want to work in H-1B status, then you need to have an H-1B visa. So you have to keep that in mind when you're traveling. A new concept that came in around 2000, 2001, it's called H-1B portability. It used to be that whenever an H-1B worker changes employers, that the new employer had to file a petition and then had to wait for the approval before you could start working for the second company. When H-1B portability came along, there's some basic requirements that if you previously have had H-1B status or visa, if you have not worked without authorization, and then once the employer files a proper petition, meaning all the documents are there, all the fees are included, it's submitted to the right location, once those criteria are met, then you can start working for the new employer. And I have a fun little diagram here. There's some pictures. So basically there's me running to the Immigration Service to file the petition. And then once the petition is pending, then you can start working. Typically what happens is, I usually say about 3 to 4 weeks is about what it takes to go from one employer to another. Because it takes time to prepare all the documents and get the petition filed, and then eventually get as I noted, the filing confirmation, which the other document that we had back here a while ago, this one right there, this one at the bottom left, that's a 797 approval notice. When an employer files a petition, it will get what's called a 797 receipt notice. And that receipt notice will look similar to this document, but it will just say this petition has been filed and it's pending. So then we go back to once you get that confirmation, then you can start working. And that usually takes, as I said, about 3 to 4 weeks from the time the company makes an offer until you can start working. So that's something to keep in mind. It doesn't happen overnight. There has to be some flexibility with the employer and then also with you. But again, you can start working while that petition is pending. Right now, petitions, H-1B petitions, are taking about 4 months. So even though the petition is pending, you can still start working for the new company. Some other things to think about. Each year, as I mentioned with the cap, there's a limited number of H-1B visas. So you need to be thinking about, if you graduate, does everybody know what OPT is, optional practical training? Just raise a hand, say yes, I know what that is. Okay, most people. So that's after you graduate, you get OPT work authorization. What you want to have happen is you want to go directly from OPT to H-1B status. So you need to be thinking about the fiscal year with the cap, with the 85,000, where the cap is, and then when your OPT expires, to make sure that you don't have a gap between your work authorization. Fortunately, there was a regulation revision about a year or two ago that avoids most gaps in employment. Because typically, a lot of people graduate in May or June, so then they get their OPT valid from May or June of the current year to May or June of the next year. And then what happens is the work authorization expires in June, but if we're in a cap situation when all the H-1B visas have been used up, then the H-1B visa could not be granted until October 1st, so you'd have a gap between June and October. There's a new regulation, or a revised regulation, that extends OPT for that gap. So that if an employer files a petition, for example, on April 1st, for an October 1st effective date, then if your OPT expires in June, that OPT will be extended automatically to September 30, so that you don't have a gap. In most cases, that the gap can be avoided, but that's something just to be thinking about when your OPT expires and when that H-1 will go into effect. I always like to give a little caution about volunteer work, because sometimes what will happen is the OPT, for example, may not be granted. You may have applied for OPT, and then the processing time may be 3 months, and then the employer says, well, we really would like for you to come in a couple of weeks early, and how about if you just come in and quote, volunteer, and then we'll give you a nice big check at the end of the year to make up for that time. That's the kind of thing I don't recommend you participate in that, because it's something that the unauthorized employment, that would be on you. Worst case scenario, you could be deported for working without authorization. It's not likely to happen, but that's the worst case scenario. The employer could have some substantial liability for having someone working without authorization. Typically, I say if you're in a period when you're waiting on OPT or you're waiting on an H-1B approval and you need to have the approval before you can start working, if you want to volunteer, go to an animal shelter, go to a hospital, go to a church. If you're a priest, don't go to a church and volunteer, but I've actually had that question come up. But keep in mind, volunteer in a situation that's typically volunteering. If you go to an environment where normally there would be an expectation of payment for services, that likely would be considered unauthorized employment. And that's the kind of thing I generally advise against. Keep in mind, if you have family members who were in perhaps F2 or J2 status, and then you change to H-1B status, there's a separate application that's required for them. If you change to H-1B status, your family status does not automatically change. So you need to be talking to the employer about that to make sure that a separate application is filed. When you change from H1 or from F1 to H1, and again, a lot of people have F1 visas, that's why I tend to focus on that. If you have F1 status, you will not have to be subject to as many withholdings in your income. Once you change to H-1B status, you will see your paycheck shrink. So just be aware of that. And that's something to think about as well when you're deciding when to make your H-1B petition effective. If you have OPT valid for a year, then maybe you don't want and if your OPT is valid until next June, you may not want your H-1 to go into effect on January 1st. You may want to wait till March or April 1st. You can push it out 6 months, so that way you can take advantage of the reduced tax withholdings. But once you change to H-1, then you're taxed as a resident. There are 4 ways to get a green card. This is a common question that I get. You know, a lot of times the running joke around our office was, people would say, well, what does a green card cost? They say, well, we don't know, they're not for sale. I'm sure you can buy a green card on the black market, but it's not going to be that. I've seen a few, and they look pretty good. Anyway, so the 4 legitimate ways to get a green card. There's employment, there's political asylum, there's family, if you have a qualifying relative, and then there's also the lottery. Each year, and the lottery is what it sounds like. For countries with historically low immigration, if you're from India and China, sorry, or some other, Mexico is also one, the UK. But if you're from another country with historically low immigration, you submit an application through the State Department, it's free, and then if you're lucky enough to be selected, then you have a certain time frame within which you apply to get a green card. Those are the 4 basic ways. I'll talk about employment a little bit later. Actually, I'll talk about it right now. It was as if I could anticipate what I was going to talk about. The one thing, as I mentioned earlier, about the 6 years of H-1B status, while an employer is pursuing a green card for you, permanent resident status, you need to be maintaining your H-1B status. So that, and again, we talked about earlier, what that means is working. If the employer sponsors you for full-time employment, then you need to be working full-time and you need to be getting paid. And the one thing to keep in mind, the benchmark that, I'll get to that in just a minute. The State Department controls how green cards are issued. And then I have some examples here to show you. I mentioned earlier that in some cases it can take up to 15 years to get a green card in the employment category. So if you go to this website, you'll see certain cutoffs, and I'll give you some examples here in a minute. And what this website does through the State Department, each year there are approximately 140,000 green cards available. No one country can consume more than 7% of that amount. And then there are different categories, and I have some examples of different categories. Let's see, I'll come back to this stuff in a minute. So the different categories, the two most common are the second and third preference categories. Some of you may have heard of EB2 or EB3. Those are the most common. And what happens is the State Department takes a look at that 140,000 cap of green cards, and then looks at the different categories, the second preference, the third preference, and then also the country of birth. And then the State Department establishes cutoff dates for pursuing a green card. And this is something you may get a sense that we could probably spend an hour talking about this topic. But basically, as I noted here, when your employer starts the green card process, you will get what's called a priority date. And that's when the employer files the first application for you. That becomes your place in the queue. So when you go into the bakery and you pull a number and it says number 50 and you look up and it says now serving 100, you know you're going to be there a while. So when your employer files the petition, that's your place in the queue. So if an employer files a petition or an application today, it'd be November 15th, 2010 would be your priority date. And that would be your place in the green card queue. And then you look at your country of birth. And again, I'll put some examples up here. And the one thing I mentioned here about the second and third preference categories, when we talk about those, what they mean are, what are the job requirements? The second preference, the job itself has to require either a master's degree or a bachelor's degree in 5 years of what's called progressive experience, meaning that the experience has to build. It can't just be doing the same thing for 5 years. It has to be doing more challenging, more difficult tasks. That's the second preference. And again, these are the job requirements. You could graduate with a PhD in nuclear physics. If you're flipping burgers at McDonald's, your job does not require a PhD in nuclear physics. So keep in mind it's the job requirements that control. The third preference category is for a job that requires at least 2 years of experience. And as a practical matter, that bachelor's degree or at least 2 years of experience. So basically anything less than a master's or 5 years in a bachelor's will be in the third preference. And then what you have, so we look at all of these different criteria. Where were you born and what are your job requirements? What are the job requirements? And then we look at that 140,000. No one country can take more than 7%. What does that lead to? It leads to this. A backlog and a waiting period. And then to put some numbers on this so you get an idea of what these numbers look like. And this was each month these cutoffs are published. And I, for example, just chose the third preference, just to give you an example. Anybody recognize that flag? A few people? Okay. Look at India. So the cutoff for November 2010, what that means is to get to your final green card stage and then eventually get your green card approved in November of 2010, your employer had to start the process January 2002. That sounds like about 8 or 9 years, but in reality it's more like 15 years because the visa bulletin does not progress on a day-by-day manner. If you look at China, it's November 22nd, 2003. And then if you look at all countries, because China